Putin is living in fear. You realize it, as Russia's leader tries desperately to project power to the world. But he knows that the war in Ukraine is lost, and he also realizes that something destructive and inevitable is closing in. But here's the kicker, that something isn't Ukraine. Putin is now more scared of his own people, and perhaps his own army, than he is of the war he started. The most bizarre war is about to begin, as Putin is preparing to fight Russia itself. As crazy a concept as that may sound, there are plenty of signs that Putin is preparing more for war inside Russia than he is attempting to win the war in Ukraine. We'll be exploring those signs throughout the video, so make sure you stick with us until the end. But the biggest signal that Putin is losing himself to his own paranoia and his desire to maintain his grasp on leadership in any way that he can comes from what is happening with the Rosgvardia right now. The Rosgvardia is growing in size and power, and this is a sign of Putin's weakness. To understand why, you need to know a little about what the Rosgvardia actually is. This organization is the National Guard of Russia, and it's the largest internal security force that the country and, more importantly, Putin has. It was Putin himself who formed this unit back in 2016, and the group already has a vast remit and significant resources, long before the latest change that Putin has instituted. Think of the Rosgvardia as being similar to Adolf Hitler's Schutzstaffel, or SS. Both the Rosgvardia and SS amount to protection squads designed to guard their leader. They serve as bodyguards and do all of the dirty work that needs doing inside their own country. While the military fights abroad, the Rosgvardia and, in the past, the SS worked to maintain security at home, which in turn protects the position of the leader who formed them. We saw how that worked out for Hitler during the 1940s. And Putin's recent changes to the Rosgvardia show that he is growing as paranoid as the Nazi leader as he tries to maintain his grip on power. That's according to Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, William James Dixon. On February 20th, the Kyiv Post reported that Putin is currently hard at work building the Rosgvardia into a parallel structure that Putin can command both on the Ukraine battlefield and use to guard himself against threats from within Russia itself. The latter was always the Rosgvardia's task, in many ways, but what we're seeing now is the further development of that group into what can only be deemed as Putin's personal army. The Rosgvardia now operates outside of the scope of Russia's defense ministry, essentially making it more powerful from a decision-making standpoint than the very organization that is overseeing Putin's Ukraine invasion. And thanks to a recent Kremlin decree, spearheaded by Putin himself, the Rosgvardia is being elevated to the point where its director, Viktor Zolotov, will only ever have to answer to Putin himself. But why do this? Why would Putin create an army of his own when Russia's military is fighting and dying in enormous numbers in Ukraine? We just gave you the answer by asking that question. Putin knows that his Ukraine war has been disastrous for his country in ways that we're going to explain later in the video. And now, as Dixon explains, there has been a shift in Putin's mindset. Russia's president knows that he has lost the war that he started. Yes, the fighting is ongoing and Russia is making slow progress. So slow that we haven't seen anything as crawlingly sluggish since World War I, but progress nonetheless. However, what was supposed to be Russia's version of a blitzkrieg devolved into a years-long fight that shows no signs of ending, and Putin knows that his people are weary. That support is waning for the invasion, and according to Dixon, the strengthening of the Rosgvardia is a sign that Putin is now trying to insulate himself from public unrest and anger from the elites. The Rosgvardia today is not what it was when Putin formed it. Rather than being an internal policing structure, Dixon notes, it has become something akin to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a Praetorian force that exists to protect the regime and, in the case of Putin's so-called National Guard, is now forming specialized units that include tank formations. This is not what a leader uses for internal security. It's what they build when they know that the consequences of their actions are incoming and they need to do whatever they can to maintain control. And Putin knows that the consequences are coming. All of the pressure that Russia now faces, the failure of the Ukraine invasion through to the intense economic pressure placed on the country by sanctions, is now coming to a head. Questions are being asked about the fragility of Putin's regime, perhaps for the first time since he came to power. Diverging opinions, though certainly not loud enough to destroy Putin, are being expressed, especially on the subject of the economy. The globalist argues that a split is forming between Putin and many of the elites that he himself put into power. They may pretend to support his war in Ukraine and are happy to profit from it, but they desperately want the hostilities to end. The globalist says, as their main interest in making more money conflicts with Putin's nationalistic and egotistical goals of turning Russia, and by extension, himself, into one of the world's foremost powers. Putin can feel this shift in support. He knows that it's coming. And so, what we're seeing with the Rosgvardia is a sign that Putin's paranoia about what comes next, whether that's after the Ukraine war or in the months and years, that the war continues to wage with no conclusion, has gotten the best of him. Simply creating a national security force into a military power inside Russia is a strong enough signal that Putin is getting worried. The fact that the Rosgvardia operates outside of the Russian Defense Ministry is enough to create problems. As Dixon puts it, the Rosgvardia is now a flashpoint for further division, which will make succession more difficult, and ultimately tries to center all of Russia's power on one man who, at 73 years old, likely doesn't have long left to maintain that power. What Putin has done is create a situation where multiple power centers will grapple over the Russian reins long after he is gone. Putin himself has raised the subject of succession before. Back in May 2025, the New Voice of Ukraine reported on a Russian documentary entitled Russia, Kremlin, Putin, 25 Years. Putin himself is filmed claiming that a person must emerge. Or better yet, several. So people have a choice. Who could earn the trust of the country's citizens? Putting aside how ridiculous that statement is for an autocrat verging on a dictator to make, what we see here is, simply put, a lie. Putin doesn't care about succession. Putin cares about Putin. And the strengthening of the Rosgvardia is one of the signs that Putin is utterly unwilling to relinquish his grip on power, even as that grip falters. Putin is preparing for a fight. Or, more accurately, he's attempting to protect himself from the inevitability of the breakdown of the regime that he has spent a quarter of a century developing. We'll be getting deeper into that and the other signs of Putin's fear of the destructive force that is closing in around him in a moment. But before we do, if this is the kind of insight that you want more of, make sure you're subscribed to the Military Show. Now, the Putin regime. What are we really seeing with the strengthening of the Rosgvardia? According to noted military analyst and YouTube creator Paul Warburg, this, along with other signs that we're about to cover, is a symptom of the breakdown of an entire regime. This is Putin putting steps in place to control the internal Russian narrative as he tries to maintain the image of himself as the strongman of Russian politics, even as his Ukraine invasion crumbles around him. And all we need to do is look at the past to see what's happening in Putin's paranoid present. When we look at the history in the twilight days of authoritarian regimes, it's very often the case that those regimes seem the strongest that they ever have, and their words sound more confident than they did at the beginning, Warburg says of what we're seeing with Putin now. But this strength is a smokescreen. An illusion cast by a failing leader who knows that his grip on power is faltering, and his weaknesses have been exposed, not just to the world, but to the people inside his own country that he is trying to control. Don't look at the words, Warburg explains. Look at the actions. And right now, there are a lot of actions that Putin is taking that are surefire signs that the regime he created is collapsing. The attempt to strengthen a supposed national security force into what amounts to a military unit controlled solely by Putin is just one of those signs. Another comes from what we're seeing in peace talks right now.